If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what's the creepiest, most mysterious thing you've seen or found? This past year, while exploring off-trail at a recently opened state park, we found this really strange place in the woods that is probably about an acre or two of land that is always pitch black, even in the middle of the day. We ran through it, and it feels creepy as hell. When we checked it out from overhead on Google Maps, it just looked like any other pine forest. The thing is, most creepy things people claim to see in the woods could be lies or have been mistaken. This creepy, light-absorbing patch of woods has been revisited many times now. I could take any one of you there and show it to you. Until about age 10, I lived in a small, somewhat remote town. A wooded area bordered our property on two sides and extended for a couple miles back. In those days, I didn't have much to occupy my time, so I often explored those woods, sometimes alone and sometimes with my mom. Some ways in, or at least a fair distance for a kid my age, I found a small, abandoned one-room house with no visible access. It had no road, driveway, or other means of explaining how someone carried the shredded couches and shattered TV through the woods to it. But what I still find most interesting is that this house matches my house and garage like a lost sibling. All three had an unusual color scheme of white, green, and red with the same wooden siding. No other house I saw in town or anywhere else matched. I visited at least a few times, and it occasionally had a slight sign of human presence, but I never saw anyone there. To this day, I'm unsure of how or why that house existed. A few years back in high school, me and a few stoners wandered off into the woods looking for a good place to smoke away from all the people and hubbub. We went right off a trail that went through a popular park, not more than 50 to 100 feet away from where foot traffic was pretty frequent. We were walking in and started to find burned scraps of paper littered everywhere. Whole pages started to appear, and we stumbled into a small clearing that had a bunch of plants built up around the side to block the view of anyone treading close. We started to smoke there, not thinking much of it until we noticed it was a Bible that had been burned, and then we started to really look around where we were. Several trees burned at the base, and weird old fluids were in rusted cans all around the edges. We hadn't noticed it, but we had been scuffing up a large pentagram that had been dragged into the dirt in the circle. Suffice to say, we found some scraps of fur and what our stone minds assumed was blood. Went back a week or two later and everything was gone or had aged to the point that it wasn't creepy, and made a pretty unanimous agreement to hightail it out of there. I know this isn't the creepiest story, but as a teenager stumbling into that kind of area and knowing the sketchy types you get in a small town farming community, I could still see some messed up shit happening. I'm not religious, and I don't get the spooks from the paranormal, but any person willing to murder an animal over their spiritual views and go to the effort these people made is truly unnerving, however you want to dice it. I have a ton of stories from living deep in the woods my whole childhood. The first one is short, but I don't know if anyone will read it anyway, so whatever. Be me, living in 10 acres of forest, never meeting my neighbors. I had a dog that patrolled our land like it was Guantanamo Bay. She would regularly kill rabbits, turkeys, deer, and a couple of other things on occasion. I was playing outside one day as a 10 to 12-year-old and said a weird thing in the grass. As I got closer, it looked like a corpse of some kind. I thought it was a skunk or something. My dog would regularly leave her kills lying around after they stopped making noise like squeaky toys, so I wasn't concerned. As I got closer, I saw that it was just a head. It was probably a foot long from snout to back of the skull, but the skin on the back half of the head was gone and looked super clean. One eye was gone, and the other was completely black with some fur stuck in it. This is where it gets weird. The teeth were really big and sharp. But some were busted out and broken in half. Its face was too messed up to tell what it was, but it didn't look like a wolf or coyote and had black fur, so it couldn't have been a mountain lion. And then the tongue. Duck. It was about 2 feet long. At first, I thought it was just a strip of flesh, but it was clearly a tongue because I could see the taste buds. It didn't look like a dog toy either. It wasn't flat. It was thick, like a person's tongue. The tongue made it clear that it hadn't been decaying, so it must have been fresh. Being a kid and living in the woods with old school parents, I didn't say shit. I went back the next day, and it was gone. I was about 15 to 16 years old and walking home from a friend's place at about 2 to 3 o'clock in the morning with the friend I was living with at the time. My buddy was pushing a BMX, and we were just talking and laughing as we walked home. All of a sudden, we saw what looked like two very large greyhounds jump over a set of mailboxes at some flats, apartments, and land in the middle of the road. The mailboxes appeared to be about 1.5 meters tall and about 5 to 6 meters from the road. At the moment, I thought it was a little strange, but I kept watching them. What I witnessed was something I will never forget in my life. The two greyhounds as they ran down the road appeared to both stand up on their hind legs and morph into a much bigger, much beefier being, which I can only describe as looking like a yowie, which I guess is the equivalent of a Sasquatch to our friends from America and other countries. These yowies both ran around a corner about 200 meters in the direction we came, and we both sat there dumbfounded. A few seconds later, we heard what sounded like a small female child scream in terror. Keeping in mind that it was around 3 a.m. in the morning and there were no children out, we both looked at each other in horror without saying a word. I jumped on the handlebars of the bike, and he pedaled that bike nonstop all the way home, about 2 kilometers away. When we got home, we locked the doors, as we had no idea what we had just seen or if they had seen where we went. After a little while, I asked him to describe what he had seen to me, as I was in disbelief, and he explained the exact same thing I witnessed. That is probably the scariest thing I have ever seen in my life. I have only told a few people about it, and I don't think a single person has believed me. They all say stuff like drugs, alcohol, blah, blah, blah. The image I provided here is pretty much what I saw once it was up on 2 feet, except I only saw it from behind as it was running down the road in the opposite direction. I was trekking in upstate New York, only about 25 miles from the nearest road. We took a side trail for fun and came across a random clearing about 2 miles off the beaten path. Most of the area was pretty swamped, even sections of the main trail were flooded, and the whole landscape was generally overgrown. This one clearing was an empty patch of knee-high grass, and the center had a staircase. A perfectly pristine staircase. Not a single leaf, speck of moss, or mote of dirt. It rained every night at about 5:30 p.m. on the dot, yet there was no sign of weather on this feature. It was like someone went into a new suburban home with a sawzall and surgically removed the main staircase, then airlifted it into the middle of nowhere. It was absolutely clean and untouched. It was concerningly unnatural. A buddy of mine has the only copy of a picture we took of him on the stairs. We took it on a Kodak disposable, and he refuses to share it. Looking at the picture apparently messed him up. Even in the moment, right after we took the picture of him on the second step, he freaked out and insisted we leave. I really don't know much, except that we weren't the only ones to have seen things like this. I was 9 years old, and I had a dream that I got home from a friend's house, and as I opened the door, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a gray rat scamper along the side of my house, so I stood there for a second just watching it. Then I looked down, and a rattlesnake was right next to my leg. Of course, I panic and step back, but the snake strikes and bites my leg. I scream and roll around, and my leg burns. Even in the dream, it burned. My father comes out and sees me on the ground, and I tell him I was bit by a rattlesnake. He rushes me to the hospital. Time gets really malleable, and I don't remember traveling to the hospital or checking in, but I end up on a bed and very distinctly get a couple doses of antivenom, but it is too late. I die, and I see my mother crying while holding my hand. I watch for a few minutes, then I wake up. Weird as a nightmare, right? But nothing to freak about. So I go about my day, play with my friends, and whatnot. When I was walking home that evening, I just randomly thought about my dream, so I stopped a bit away from the door and actually looked around to see where the snake was in the dream. Mother Ducker was exactly where I dreamt he was, basically staring at me but never rattled. Then a ducking rat goes darting down the side of my house. I change course and go to the front door instead. I tell my dad about the snake, and he goes out and kills it with a shovel. I haven't had another vivid dream of the future since. It still freaks me out, though. When I was around 8 to 9 years old, it was the first time my parents let me stay home alone since they were out doing something, dinner or something of that sort. I can't remember exactly. It was around 10 o'clock to 10:30 p.m., I would say, as it was very dark outside. I heard some weird scratching and whispering sounds coming from downstairs. My room was on the top floor, and I was starting to get a little antsy. I opened my door and exited my room. The scratching was getting louder, and the whispering was getting more intense. For whatever reason, just about every light in the house was turned off, so when I exited my room, it was pretty much pitch black in the hallway, aside from the light coming from my room. I went out into the hallway and flipped the switch on, the light turned on, and the scratching and whispering noises suddenly just stopped altogether. I looked down the stairs, and I saw a hand and arm curve around the corner leading into the living room, and it started to make a sort of come hither motion with its finger. Keep in mind that this hand is incredibly disproportionate to what a normal human hand should look like. The fingers were way too long, and the nails were massive. The entire situation was just wrong, and I was absolutely terrified. I just ran back into my room and hid in the closet for the next half hour until my parents got home. When they arrived, They called me back down, and I was incredibly disturbed to find numerous tiny scratch marks etched into the ceiling and walls right beneath my room. I asked my parents if they had been home for a while, and of course they said that they hadn't. I tried to explain what happened, but I doubt that they believed me at all. I still get a weird and deeply disturbed feeling when approaching stairs, which is an odd fear, to say the least. This is easily the strangest thing I have ever experienced, and it still doesn't make sense to me to think about it now. About 6 years ago, I was at my boyfriend's, now fiancé's, house. He lived in a secluded area down a dirt road. There were other houses, but his property was very private and surrounded by trees, and the houses were not close together. You could only ever see the closest neighbor's house through the trees during the fall and winter after the leaves fell. The house and property never really felt welcoming. I'm not sure how to explain it exactly, but I never enjoyed being outside there, even though it was beautiful and quiet. There was a large deck, but we never used it. There were woods all around the house, and in the woods was a weird pond that the dogs would sometimes play in. I went to the pond only once, just me and the dogs. There was a foot trail to the pond, and while I was walking it, I saw what appeared to be very long human hair on the ground. I thought it was strange but continued to the pond. When I got there, the water was completely black, and I didn't think the dogs should play in it anymore, so I tried to call them back, but they wouldn't come. That was also strange because the dogs were always so well behaved and always came when I called them. I went about my day, not thinking much more about this particular incident, but I still continued to think about the pond and the woods and the strange feeling I got while I was there, but I would always brush it off. Later in our relationship, I ended up moving in with him. It was very dark out there at night, and there were no floodlights. It was a manufactured home that sat on a foundation, and the windows and doors were probably about 8 feet off the ground. We were huge night owls and worked swing shifts, and it was 2 a.m. on a weeknight when this happened. We had the bedroom window open, and it had no screen. We didn't have air conditioning, and we lived in the south at the time, so it was hot during the summer. Anyway, we were just hanging out and had some music playing, and I was sitting on the bed with my legs crossed, back facing the window, and my fiancée was sitting at a small table facing me. Suddenly the hair on my arm stands up and I get goosebumps all over my body. My fiancée randomly stands up, and all I can hear next are footsteps outside, like someone running towards the window and getting close fast. I stood up so fast and screamed. I don't know why I screamed, but I did. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread and fear. By the time I was standing up and had turned around, the curtains were flying around like a strong gust of wind was blowing them, but it was so still and quiet outside that night, and there was no wind. The curtains settled almost immediately, and all was silent again. We both saw it, felt it, and couldn't explain it. We have only talked about it twice, the night it happened and the next day. We've never spoken about it again, and it still scares the snot out of me. I only lived there for 8 months before we moved out of state, but thinking back on it now, I don't think we were ever alone out there. Nearly 20 years ago, my best friend and I were camping with my family. A place we had both basically grown up at, so we knew the location quite well. Anyhow, being the delinquents we were, we both left the campsite around midnight to smoke a joint. We walked 5 minutes to a park that was on the ocean, with a dense forest jutting up against it. We are on the beach when we finish smoking and are enjoying the stars for a few minutes when we both notice something about 150 feet up the beach along the forest trail. I still have a hard time describing what we saw. Approximately 6 orbs of light appear on the trail, which runs parallel to the beach. They form a horizontal line and start moving towards us. These lights are orbs, and unlike a flashlight, they do not project any light. No beams like a flashlight, no area like a candle, none of the trees nearby lit up. They were more of a white light than the orange of a candle. Upon seeing them move towards us, we are both filled with an immediate sense of dread and decide we're not sticking around. We hightailed it out of there. My friend glanced over while we were running perpendicular to the location, and he insists he saw them form a circle and hover down to the ground. Upon discussing it for a bit, we go back armed with weapons and flashlights to see, and there is nothing to note. I have to iterate that this was not in a location where fireflies reside, and even if there was a human element behind these lights, they were moving towards us at a pace people couldn't possibly move through a wooded forest in pitch darkness. I'm in my 30s now with a family, and whenever I see my friend, we still talk about it and shake our heads just trying to explain it. When I was in high school in the 1980s, there was this story about a local church in the country, long abandoned, where there were satanic gatherings every Sunday at midnight. The front door was painted red. There was a long dirt road to the right of the church that led to an abandoned farmhouse. Legend has it that the farmer killed his entire family one night. So, an old stone church, no parking lot, a cemetery directly in front of the church, and the dirt path on the right leading to the farm 3 miles away. The layout is important later, on an unlit blacktop 5 miles away from any houses or main roads. We were 18, and it was the summer after graduation. My friend Darla and I were driving around with her annoying friend Betsy, who was sitting in the backseat. I was driving Darla's car, she was the passenger. It was around 11:30 p.m. when Darla and I decided I should drive us to the church to see if the stories were true. Betsy freaked out in the backseat the entire way, and I was between wanting to smack her and wanting to laugh. Around 11:50 p.m., I pulled up and decided to scare Betsy by pulling into the dirt lane. I was about 25 miles in. Betsy freaked out, and I was laughing. Darla was high. 2 minutes later, a station wagon pulls into the driveway behind us. At 11:53 p.m. on a Sunday, it was 2 elderly people, around 80 years old. Dressed in Sunday best, both frail and white-haired. They stayed, and we discussed. Betsy, OMG, get us out. Me, there's no way out except backwards. I wasn't going any further down the drive, and there was a cemetery to my left, a stone church at my upper left, and a thatch of trees to my right. We were effectively trapped. Darla, you think they're devil worshippers? Me, no. Betsy, haven't you seen Rosemary's Baby? They were old. I'm trying to stay calm when another car pulls behind the station wagon. It's now 11:57 p.m. Woof. It's a brown Dodge. A young kid gets out, walks up to the old couple, and talks to them for a while. Okay, they know each other. Now I'm getting freaked out. I call out to the old man, could you please back up? Can you ask the guy behind you to back up? We'd like to leave. Thank you. Darla says the kid came to my window and threatened to gut me with a knife he showed me. I don't remember that. The old man unleashed a torrent of curse words I still don't understand. He called me a crap, witch, and everything in between, telling me he couldn't because he didn't know the kid, so he couldn't be rude and ask the guy to move. His wife just sat there. I said, yes, you do know him, he just walked up to your car and talked to you. Then, suddenly, they both left. I peeled out and took off down the road. I didn't see their cars or lights, and it's a fairly straight road. 20 seconds later, the kid jumps out of the bush on the side of the road, right in front of the car. We screamed, I swerved, and we never went there again. I used to work as a sleep study technician at various sleep clinics. When I first got the job, a few of my fellow techs warned me about the haunted clinic. I thought they were joking. They weren't. They told me about the creepy things that would happen there. Some technicians refused to work there again. I was already assigned to a couple of clinics and hoped I would never have to work at the haunted one. It was probably a year into the job when the tech who was working that clinic quit, and I was asked to take over there starting that night. Dread started building up in the pit of my stomach when I saw that place. It was a creepy old Victorian mansion that was divided up into a bunch of doctors' offices, around 130 years old, based on a little research I did on it later. It originally belonged to some prominent local politicians, then was turned into apartments, then into offices. I told myself it was just an old house, no big deal. I walked into the dark lobby, turned on the lights, and walked up the creaky stairs to the sleep clinic on the second story. I took a tour of the clinic, getting myself acquainted with it. I felt fine until I got to what was formerly a kitchen and was now used as a storage and prep room. I started feeling uneasy. Right next door was the final room, which was one of the bedrooms the patients would sleep in. I hated that room. I got bad vibes as soon as I stepped into it. I didn't even believe in places being haunted, but that room made me start to consider it. It was always so much colder than the rest of the clinic. Poor insulation, I would tell myself. Doors would swing open on their own. It's just gravity, the doors aren't level, I would tell myself. I would hear creaking floorboards when I knew there was no one else in the building, just the sleeping patients and myself. Old houses creak, I would tell myself. I would think I saw shadows and lights out of the corner of my eye. Just my imagination. That one room kept getting infested with bugs, but never the other rooms. The TV in there kept breaking. The light bulbs kept going out. The sleep study equipment would malfunction. The patients I put to sleep in that one room would complain. It was too cold, it felt creepy, and they felt like they were being watched. No one ever complained about the other bedroom in the clinic. I worked nights at that clinic for a couple years. Finally, one day at the end of my shift, I woke up the patient who was sleeping in the problem room. I knew she slept poorly based on her sleep study. I asked her how she was feeling. She told me she didn't sleep well because she kept dreaming over and over again that there were dead bodies in the walls. I could tell she was scared. I couldn't take it anymore after that. After the patients left, I had to go back in that room and clean it up as I trembled and thought about how I was all alone in the building. When I finished up, I literally ran out of the building to my car. I decided to finally quit. It turns out I didn't have to. The doctor decided to close the clinic. I only had to work another 2 or 3 nights there. Thankfully, on those nights I only had one patient, so I was able to put them in the good bedroom and leave the problem room alone. My friend and I were on a walk today. We just decided to go down each trail we came to. There were no time or distance constraints on the walk, just a long hike. We're off enjoying the scenery, the sun, the trees, and some good intellectual conversation about politics, relationships, life, religion, and all that. We don't see anyone for hours, there are no signs of people. Even the leader has disappeared. We're secluded. Occasionally we hear a plane off in the distance, but otherwise there are no signs of humanity. It was glorious and beautiful. Then we see the shrine, as we chose to call it. It was nothing of the sort, really, but we weren't sure what it could be classified as. There were 2 statues and a chest. One statue was about a foot tall. The other is about 6 inches. Both represented the figure of death. A skeletal figure, hooded and cloaked, carrying a staff for the smaller one and a reaper for the larger one. The chest was wooden and quite nice, but it had the image of a skull carved into it. We opened it to find a bracelet inside. No inscription. No design. Just a simple link bracelet that appeared to be made of gold. Everything was set up rather neatly. And even though there was a thin layer of dirt over it all, the totems were remarkably clean. We looked around and saw nothing else of import. We thought about taking the items, or even just the bracelet, but ultimately decided against it. We left and found our way back to civilization several hours later. This is from a friend of mine. His family moved into a new house when he was a kid, and he remembers quite vividly that he would wake up at night and see a man standing in his doorway just staring at him. He was quite young and didn't quite grasp the situation. He thought it might have been his dad checking on him from time to time. He told his parents about it, and it eventually stopped. He stopped seeing this figure standing at the door at night. He didn't think too much of it later in life. He assumed he had experienced sleep paralysis or something similar. 20 years later, it came up in a conversation with his parents, and they told him that it freaked the living shit out of them when their 5-year-old son told them he sees people at night. His dad never stood at the door just staring at him. Especially not on the days when he saw this figure at the door. After learning about the previous owner of the house committing suicide, they called a priest, who came over and blessed the house. That's around the time my friend stopped talking about seeing a man in his doorway at night. This thing that he would see at night never approached him, never talked to him, and never moved. I just stood there, looking at him. My friend legit thought he had sleep paralysis for years, until his parents revealed the whole priest thing decades later. It really freaked him out. I was like 9 or 10, hunting with my dad in the California Sierra Nevadas. We were in a wide valley with a mountain to one side and a meadow in the middle, which we camped in, and a river on one side of the camp that flowed through the meadow. The tree line was maybe 100 yards away. The meadow had mid-calf high grass covering it and was boggy due to the river. It was very late, Dad and his hunting partner had gone to sleep. Full moon, I could see all the way across the meadow in all directions. It was really amazing, and I can still see it now, 30 plus years later. I was a kid and couldn't sleep very easily while outdoors in the woods, so I was still awake trying to go to sleep. No tents or anything, just a sleeping bag next to a burned out fire under the stars. It must have been between 11 and 12 p.m. We had a beagle with us, Casey, our farm dog. She came over to me and whined. She got in the sleeping bag with me, which wasn't odd or a big deal, but her sitting in the bottom of the bag whimpering and shaking was really weird. I figured there was a bear, mountain lion, or something around and sat up to look around just as a crashing sound came from the tree line. I look over and see a large, very large figure striding through the edge of the tree line. I say it was striding because the way its arms and legs were swinging, it was obviously walking fast. Its gait was odd, it was built like a person but moved oddly, like its skeletal structure wasn't quite the same. I was a farm kid who grew up with cattle. I knew what conformation and gait meant, but it was odd. It was very tall. I remember thinking how tall it was at the time, even though it was far away. I have great vision as well, 20/10 at the time, so I could see it with no problem but not much detail. It was in the shadow the moon cast right at the edge of the tree line. It never saw me or did anything dramatic. It just kept walking for a bit, kicked a log in its way as it moved, then disappeared into the trees. At this point, I was fairly freaked out. I had no idea what I was seeing, but I knew it wasn't right. There shouldn't be anyone out there walking around like that at that time of day. A person would have walked the dirt road for sake of ease and or had a light, even with a full moon. It was dark in the trees, and it walked into them like nothing. The beagle wouldn't get out of the bag, so I bit the bullet and woke Dad up, figuring I would rather be in trouble for waking him up over nothing than go to sleep with whatever the hell was moving around us in the dark. He listened to me, woke his hunting partner up, and they both saw the dog having none of it and cowering in my sleeping bag, so they figured a bear had been around and didn't believe me. Dad said to just go to sleep. If whatever it was bothered us, the dog would get a lot louder, and so would we. Everyone slept with pistols close at hand. I didn't sleep. I didn't see or hear anything else that night. In the morning, when everyone woke up, Dad asked me if I remembered it the same or if things had changed given a night to think about it. He obviously thought I made it up. When I stuck to it, he let me know that things that big leave trails and tracks, and if we looked and found nothing, then what? I said I didn't know. Let's go look. We found a cattle trail, whatever it was, following a dirt track through the meadow and along the edge of the trees. No tracks, but soft grass right next to the trail it could have walked on. I mentioned the crash. We walked back along the trail and found two spots where a log lying across or along the trail had been broken, shoved aside, or stomped through. Dad figured it was a bear, and we went on with our day. I knew it was something weird, though. It just didn't move right. I can still see it walking along the tree line in my mind's eye, and it still looks just off. I grew up around big dudes, some of them were straight giants, and it didn't match how they moved. Here's the kicker. I had no idea what Bigfoot or Sasquatch was at that time. My parents were super Christian and never let me read or watch anything about it. Growing up on a little farm in a small California town made it easy to not be exposed to that stuff at a young age. It wasn't until I got back and started trying to figure out what I saw that I read about Bigfoot and Sasquatches in the library and realized what I thought I had seen fit that more than anything else. It still creeps me out. I'll always wonder. Two friends and I were driving back from a party on a small country road near where we live. We often use it as a shortcut. It's a little known road, sinuous, in poor shape, and with forest and stone walls on the sides. There's hardly ever anyone driving on this road, and there are no houses or farms around. It was around 4 a.m. I was on the back seat, plastered, admittedly, and staring out the window. I suddenly saw a person standing at the edge of the forest, about 15 meters away. Size of a large man, with a cap or hat of some kind. At first immobile, his posture turned towards us as we drove by. I sobered the duck up instantly, rose up on my seat, and yelled, "What the duck?" My friends asked, "What? What?" I said, "There's a guy out there." At first, they were incredulous, but from my reaction, they started to freak out too. A friend on the passenger seat asked whether we should back up to check, and the driver said, "Oh yeah, sure," and accelerated away. There was absolutely no reason for someone to be there at this time. It wasn't hunting season. No one lives anywhere near. We talked about it afterward, and both my friends remain skeptical to this day, even though they both chickened out big time. But I'm 100% sure there was someone. I grew up in a small town in Georgia, kind of out in the woods. My grandfather had purchased land out there but later moved to some suburbs and left the land to his kids. My uncle got the original house, close to the road. My aunt graveled a driveway quite a ways further onto the property and lived in a trailer there. When I was 6, we moved from Tennessee, and my parents built their dream home on my dad's share of the property, sharing my aunt's driveway but diverting right before her trailer and going even further onto the land. So we were pretty far away from the main road. They built a single-story home, but it was kind of on a hill and had a basement. So there was a back door that led into one of the rooms in the basement, but the rest of it was underground. They always planned on turning the basement into a basement, but it really never got finished. Only the right half of the rooms really had dry walls up, and the two left rooms they never dry-walled and my dad used as a workshop area. My dad developed epilepsy and lost his job, but he was doing landscape-type work for this morbidly obese hoarder woman. The woman got evicted from her home, and our unfinished basement, which was already full of old stuff my parents had gotten over the years, became filled with a bunch of her hoarder stuff, because she was paying us to keep it, I guess. All of these things were stored in the large room that the back door opened into. I was somewhere around the age of 12 when this happened. My parents had taken my sister out shopping or something, but the main thing is that I was home alone. I was upstairs watching TV when I got up to use the bathroom. I'm in the hallway, and I hear music coming from somewhere. I finally traced the music to coming from a vent down close to the floor. 12-year-old me knows the ventilation ducting is in the roof of the basement. So I decided to go on an adventure and put a stop to this music. The basement access is right after you go through the front door of the house. It looks almost like a closet, but if you open it, there is a stairwell that leads down and then cuts a 90-degree angle left and continues down. So when you're standing at the top, you can pretty much only see stairs and walls, no basement. I always hated it, and it creeped me out, and that stairwell usually had the only working light, and because you went underground, the basement was always way colder than upstairs. I slowly walked down the lit stairwell into the darkness. When you reach the bottom, it opens up into the left side basement rooms that were unfinished and were my dad's workshop. I peered around the edge of the stairwell and looked down the hallway into the more finished areas. While I'm doing that, I try to turn on the lights because the light switch is right there in the stairwell. Click click, no light. But coming from the big room with all the hoarder stuff in it, there's a glowing green light. I can't not check it out, I have to know. So I go into the darkness, my heart pounding. I make it to the entrance of the room and stand there for a second or two, getting my bearings and trying to figure out where the light is coming from. In the very middle of the room, there's a path cutting through all the junk and they're leading to the back door, and right next to the back door, sitting on some old dressers, is a really old, really big stereo system my dad had picked up. It was playing some radio station or something, with the little green screen causing the weird green glow. I ran in and grabbed the plug and unplugged it real quick because I didn't want to take time in the creepy darkness to try to figure out which button turned it off. I tested the back door real quick, which was always locked, to make sure it was still locked. Then I'd take off like a demon is right behind me, towards the light of the stairwell, and zip back up the stairs and slam and lock the door to the basement. Take a breath. I laugh at myself for being silly. Go back to watching TV. After a little bit, I decided to go back to my room and get a book I was really interested in. Crossing through the hallway, I heard a sound that made my hair stand up, and my eyes actually started to tear up. I still have zero explanation for it to this day. But there was the music again, drifting up through the vents. I took off running out the front door, ran all the way up the driveway to my uncle's house, and refused to leave until I heard my parents driving down the gravel road returning home. When we got home, I made my dad come and check it out with me. Sure enough, the radio was plugged in again. My dad said maybe I had grabbed one of the other plugs that was lying down near the outlet, but I remember the radio having been the only thing plugged in when I grabbed it. He also said it was probably an electrical issue in the radio that had made it turn on since it was so old. But duck that property and duck that house. I played in the woods all the time and would find old Native American arrowheads. If you climbed through a barbed wire fence and went onto the neighbor's land, there was the foundation of a burnt-out settler home from the 1800s with 3 graves at it. All of my family members had stories about seeing weird stuff in the woods. Both of my parents died in that house, and one of the tenants that rented it after I went to live with my grandparents said they saw my mom. I don't believe in ghost stories and think people make most of that stuff up, including the seeing my mom thing and a lot of the stuff my family saw in the woods. But I know I ducking heard that music, and I know I unplugged that radio. I used to live with a friend and his family. They live in the woods, houses are visible to the left and the right, though with a fair distance between them, but his property extends pretty far back into the woods. A large section of his backyard has a fence around it, and the property extends even farther and is a good bit more wooded until you get to someone else's house or backyard. For imagining distances, from the back of his house to the fence is probably a 2 to 3 minute walk. One late night, we had a bonfire in his backyard. And we watched this floating yellow light move around in the woods. The distances it was moving at the speed it was moving seemed way too fast for a person with a flashlight. It was really moving around quick. Sometimes it seemed it would just be on the inside part of the fence, and other times it would be farther out from the fence. We watched it for a good 30 to 45 minutes, just wandering back and forth around in his woods. One of the times it was within the fence line and getting somewhat close to us. A couple of us crept towards it in the woods by about 20 feet, and it retreated farther into the woods. We went back to the fire, and it just kept wandering around in the woods. We decided to leave it alone at that point. We weren't about to be led into a dark wood by some strange floating light. Probably the strangest thing I've ever seen, and something I can't quite explain. Later in the night, we watched a red light doing something similar, but it was moving much shorter distances and at a slower speed. It could have been explained by someone with a flashlight wandering around. I was stopped for the night at a truck stop in the desert, 60 miles east of El Paso, TX. This truck stop only has lights around the store and fuel pumps. The truck parking area is only lit by any headlights that are left on. I get to bed at about 2200, thinking it'll be a nice, quiet night. At around 0230, I wake up to a tapping on my truck, like someone was trying to wake me up. I ignore it and try to go back to sleep, but the tapping gets louder and louder and eventually turns into a sound similar to someone beating their hand on my door and cab. I get out of bed and open the curtains to the side where I heard the sound coming from, and there is nothing there. I opened the curtains on the other side, and there was nothing there either. There were no trucks on either side of me. So I threw my shoes on, grabbed my machete and flashlight, and went outside to see what the hell was going on. There was nothing, no footprints, no paw prints, absolutely nothing there. I get back in my truck and turn in my side markers, so I'm somewhat illuminated. Close the doors, lock them, and run my seatbelts through the door handle and buckle them in, to add essentially another lock to both doors. I go back to bed and wake up at 0630. The sun is starting to come out, so I go inside for some coffee and breakfast before heading out. Other truck drivers were in there and experienced the same thing I did that night. With no answers as to what it was. I finish my breakfast, and nope, the duck out of there. A little backstory, I used to live in a house that backed onto a cemetery. It was nice, had lots of nature, and was quiet. At this point, I had been living there for 3 years, and nothing weird had ever happened. One night, while I was making dinner, I heard knocking at my back door. I freeze, as no one should be in the backyard. I carefully walk towards the door, pausing halfway there. The knocking turns into someone slamming their hand against the door. I pick up my fencing épée and walk towards the door. I pull the curtains back to reveal no one. I open the door and look around, but no one is out there. I look down to see mud on the concrete. I try to brush it off when I hear water running in my bathroom. I hold my sword in front of me and walk towards my bathroom. Again, no one, but the sink is on. I turn it off before searching the whole house and find nothing. I don't think of it, and I eat my dinner and then watch some TV. Again, I hear knocking, this time at my front door. I open it up, and it's my neighbor. He looked mad and demanded to know what kind of joke I was playing. Confused as duck, I ask him what he means. He said his son saw a woman climbing over the shared part of our fence, and he assumed it was me. I told him about the knocking and my sink being on, and he told me if I tried anything again, he would call the cops on me. I decided then that I should be done for the night. Around 1 a.m., I hear someone pounding on the back door, and this time a female voice says, "Help. My husband is trying to kill me." I immediately ran and threw open the door again, to no one. I search around my yard and find nothing. I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't. That morning I went to have breakfast in my backyard when I heard someone in the cemetery talking about how he had been caught and would be charged. Curious, I walk into the cemetery and see a fresh grave. I look at the temporary name card and Google the name. It turns out that buried behind my yard was a woman who was murdered by her husband. I stand there staring at the mound of dirt, wondering why she did all that. I went back to my house, and nothing ever happened again. I still think about that night. I was stationed in rural Missouri a few years ago. My wife, at the time, and I were driving down a dirt road to get back to the main highway after a day spent fishing in one of the rivers. We were a few miles from the highway, and there were houses here and there along the path, but it was mostly Mark Twain National Forest. We were at the bottom of a dip in the road and going uphill when we saw something coming towards us in the road. It took me a minute to realize that it was a pack of dogs. Every size. Every description. Long-haired, short-haired, wire-haired, everything from little grandma lapdogs to big rotty-looking dogs, maybe close to 3 dozen in total, are just running full bore, taking up the entire road ahead of us. WTF.gif as I slowed down to a crawl and allowed them to pass us. They did so without stopping, slowing down, or even looking at us. As if we weren't there, they just kind of split in the middle and ran around our truck. I stuck my head out of the window and looked back as they kept going, and not one turned around to look back at us, they just kept on running. They were actually kicking up quite a dust cloud. I have to admit that I was apprehensive about driving further. I couldn't stop thinking about how dogs are supposed to be more attuned to when shit hits the fan. I had no idea where these dogs could have come from or where they were going. It was odd that no one looked up at us as we crawled past. Back in the 90s, a friend and I were out at my family's hunting camp in the woods with my dad and a few others. We had been drinking a bit and had a decent buzz. He and I got bored, so we went out exploring around some trails. About the time it got dark, we came across an old dead tree that had fallen over, and as we got close to it, we realized that this mother ducker was glowing. Like actually glowing in the dark. We could not understand that for the life of us and were completely amazed. We each broke off a piece of this magic tree and saved it to show everyone. Well, of course, by the time we got home the next day, these goddamn pieces of wood we saved were no longer glowing and never would again. Not one person would believe us no matter how much we tried to convince them, claiming we were just drunk, etc. We knew what we saw, however, and were not drunk. Then, a few months later, in school, my class was reading one of those books we always read together. I can't remember what book it was now, maybe Tom Sawyer or something, but it talked about glowing wood. It's apparently called foxfire and is caused by the decomposing of the wood in some way I cannot recall. I promptly made it known to everyone that this had to be proof of what we saw, although I still don't really think anyone believed us. This is something I will claim to have seen until I die, though. When I was 17, 13 years ago, during the summer I did the Outward Bound program in Oregon. This was typically a program for juvenile delinquents, but I wanted a challenge because I had plans to join the Marine Corps. The first week was whitewater rafting down 80 miles of the Deschutes River in Bend, Oregon. The second week was spent ascending to the top of the Middle Sister Mountain. On the way back down, there was a terrible lightning storm, and all of a sudden our ice picks started ringing like crazy, so our guide yelled at us to throw anything metal off our bodies. We do. About 15 seconds later, a huge lightning bolt hit the pile of picks, canteens, etc., and the whole lot melted instantly. But that's still not what I'm here to talk about. The last night before we got shipped back to Portland, we were 5 miles from any road in the middle of the woods. Huddled around a campfire with 2 guides, we are all telling ghost stories. After a few hours, we headed off to bed when we heard this loud, very loud, smacking noise coming from a tree about 100 feet away. Initially, we thought it was one of our guides ducking with us. So we start laughing, and it laughs back, and you could tell it didn't sound human. Scared and afraid, we go to our guide's tent, and surprising to us, both of them are in their tent. We asked them if they heard the noise, and they said yeah, but they thought it was us. So one guide grabs his spotlight and shines it in the general direction of where the noise was coming from. At first, we didn't see anything until someone pointed out 2 red beady eyes peering behind a tree. Guide shines the light right at it, and lo and behold, there is a head peering around a tree staring right at us with one hand gripping the tree at approximately 7 feet off the ground, we measured later. As we were all struck in awe by what we were looking at, it gracefully disappeared in the opposite direction, and not a single noise was made. All of us were convinced we had just seen a Sasquatch, and to this day, I believe that is what I saw. About 17 years ago, I was living in an older single-story ranch-style house with 2 roommates. Both of my roommates happened to be out of town for the weekend, one for his birthday and the other at a music festival. I was working the closing shift at a busy restaurant, so I didn't get home until about 2 a.m. I decided to take a shower before bed instead of my usual morning routine because I smelled like restaurant grease. I'm standing there in the bathroom with the door closed, waiting for the water to warm up, butt-ass naked, mind you, when it sounds like someone soccer kicked the door 5 feet away from me. I'm petrified. How could I ever properly defend myself against a home invader with my most vulnerable areas being so open and exposed? I turned the water off and started with the macho talk. You'd better be gone by the time I open this door, or you'll be eating a 9mm sandwich for dinner. You know, the scary, threatening stuff. I sat in perfect silence for what seemed like an eternity before I started to dismiss the whole situation as a sudden wind gust, etc. I turned the shower water back on, and not 2 minutes later, here it is again, only this time I watched the door shake from the impact. I turned the water back off and stood silently again for another eternity. I finally mustered up the courage to run directly across the hallway to my bedroom, where I could at least throw on some clothes and find some sort of weapon. Ah, sweet mercy, a baseball bat. My hero. I throw on some clothes and decide, enough is enough, and it's time to fight. I fling open the bedroom door and ninja my way down the hallway, listening intently for clues. As I approach my dining room, I see. Wait for it. A single red balloon, which had separated itself from my roommate's birthday balloon bouquet that was in his bedroom from the day before, and this balloon was dancing around the room in a really unnerving fashion. Kind of right at eye level. I'm now so freaked out that I want to cry. And I'm a dude. I noped my way back into my room, locked the door behind me, and called the police. They show up about 10 minutes later and do a comprehensive walkthrough of the entire house, looking everywhere for someone or something. Nothing. They told me it was probably just the house settling, and if I heard anything else, I should call them back. After the cops left, I decided it was time to just say duck it and try to go to sleep. As I'm laying there in bed, bordering on consciousness and sleeplessness, I hear the very faint sound of a man and a woman snickering, almost in a very proud look at what we did kind of way. Where is this sound coming from? Why, it's coming from the air vent directly above my bed, of course. My roommates didn't believe me when I told them, but either way, my days were numbered in that little house. I packed up and moved a few weeks later.